All right, well, let's get started. So, want to introduce ourselves really quickly. My name's Paul Bohl. I'm Director of Data Management at Mercy.
And my name's Adam Doyle. I'm the tech lead for big data initiatives at Mercy.
And if you read some of our speaker information in the app, you'll know that, oops, they didn't get the new copy in here. Okay. Well, what I was going to say was that if you read our speaker bios in the application, in the app on the phone, it said that I was the founder and CEO of Mercy. And I had a picture here of the founder and CEO of Mercy. It's not me. It's this lady from 1831, a Catholic nun who founded the organization a long time ago. And unfortunately, Adam's also not the chief technology officer. So anyway, here is a little bit about Mercy. We're a large healthcare system in the Midwest. We've got 35 acute care hospitals, 700 clinics, 2,000 some physicians, 40,000 plus coworkers, lots of other statistics. What it comes down to is we're about the 15th largest healthcare system in the nation. So that's pretty sizable when it comes down to actual healthcare providers in the nation. We're going to talk about why we do Hadoop, how we got to where we are, and our current projects that we're working on right now. So I'll give you a little bit of background about how we got to doing Hadoop. About 3 years ago, we did a very, very small project, started to explore some ideas around Hadoop and analyzing the way that clinicians actually provide care. What are some of the most common pathways for delivering care and things like that. We did some proofs of concept over the next 2 years, spent a lot of time talking with a lot of different vendors. We talked to Hortonworks, to MapR, to Teradata, to Cloudera, kind of everybody across the board, and took some ideas, built them out really, really small, and started shopping them around inside our organization. Just a whole bunch of different ideas, anything we could come up with, did some little prototypes and took them out to the business. And finally, what we came up with was about a year ago, we finally hit a project that was ready to actually take on building out a Hadoop cluster, and that's the big thing that we're going to talk about today. In healthcare, the question is why? Why are we really interested in Hadoop? What problems are we trying to solve? What are the technical challenges? And the biggest thing is that when we're trying to provide clinical decision support, we can't be relying on data that's been sitting around for days. It can't be data that comes from yesterday's activity. It has to be data about right now. So imagine going into your doctor and saying, hey, here's all this information about me. Can you help me? What's wrong with me? And if the doctor said, well, you know what, I'll get back to you tomorrow to tell you what's wrong with you, that's really not good enough. And so is typically in our healthcare systems the kind of decision support that we're providing. At best, we see what happened yesterday. So real-time analytics became a huge part of what drove us to be looking at Hadoop, to be looking at new kinds of technology. So Adam's going to walk you through our architecture, and then I'm going to talk a bit about the use cases.
Thank you. So just to give you an idea on what our technical architecture looks like, our electronic medical record system, or EMR, is Epic. We currently have 4 instances of Epic, which puts us in the upper 10% of Epic users across the country. Our traditional reporting database is called Clarity. It currently sits on Oracle, and it's about 26 terabytes. We had to slim it down to 26 terabytes by getting out all the access log data. So our first cut at this was, well, what if we can take some of these tables that people are doing reporting on, move it off to the Hadoop cluster so that they can do their reports against that database. So we use Scoop to query against the database, got a nightly delta, and then we used a pig process to merge the nightly data with the old data, and then we would do a file replace, and now you have yesterday's data today. That worked up to a point. Probably through the first 30 files, that worked just fine. But then when they asked for 30 more and then 50 more on top of that, it just didn't scale. And part of the reason why it didn't scale was what we were doing in the middle with that merge statement. You ended up spending a lot of time processing stuff. And for some of our tables, they were all reference data. or relatively small tables, and there was really no reason to spend a lot of time performing this merge when essentially we're going to find out that the old data is just the same as the new data. So we ended up taking that approach and dividing our tables into two categories. Some we applied a kill and fill approach, and some we went ahead and applied the merge approach that we had been doing. And that worked pretty well. But then we came up with a new requirement from the business. They wanted to do change data capture. Now, with the whole kill and fill approach and using the Scoop database to get yesterday's data, that worked really well, but I couldn't tell you which of these records represented inserts. I couldn't tell you which one of these records represent updates. And so heaven help us if you decided to delete something. We would never find out about it. So we realized that our EMR was feeding our traditional database reporting system with a whole bunch of tab-delimited files. And as soon as we heard that those were tab-delimited files, there was a collective facepalm, because if there's anything that Hive does really well, it's sit on top of tab-delimited files and pretend that they're a database. So right now we have 4 different flavors. For some of our smaller tables, we're still doing a kill and fill approach. And then for the larger tables, we are going ahead and we're computing the deletes, the updates, and the inserts. Now, we got really excited around the time Hive 14 came out because we were looking at just applying simple update statements. But it turns out that Hive 14, while an improvement over all the existing versions in that it gave us an update, wasn't extremely performant in terms of performing those kind of updates at scale. In order to perform our updates, we're deleting the old records and inserting the new records. It's a little bit of a kludgy solution, but it works. But that's not really where sort of the meat and excitement is. What really got us funded, what got everyone excited about us doing our work was when we said real-time clarity. How can I get you information about today's patients today? So we talked with one of our cache admins, and he had an idea on some way that we could use some of the cache processes, perform some textual manipulation, and take that from a binary form into a textual form. Once it was sitting in a textual form, then all we need to do is do some processing on it, and then we can store it in our Hadoop cluster. Initially, we were looking at storing that data in Hive, doing a partition and merge strategy, but the code behind that ended up being really, really complex, and we decided we're not going to do that because, once again, Hive 14 came in. When someone who's doing storm processing hears the word streaming ingest, they get really excited because this is going to be really easy. All I have to do is plug Storm into the Hive 14 framework, and everything will flow in perfectly. Except for you really had to read in the fine print to understand that streaming ingest meant streaming inserts. So all of a sudden, our database started blowing out, and it was, well, what's going on? We're inserting duplicate records for every update. So we ended up going back to our original design, where we're taking the data out of our EMR system and landing in HBase. HBase actually ends up being a really good a good place for us to land the data, because essentially the messages that we're getting out of our EMR system are really at the level of cell-level updates. And so it fits better the structure that we're given to go ahead and land them into HBase. And we were using HBase anyway because we were storing some of the data for key mapping. So we just didn't need to take on the additional technology. So in order to support that batch process, as I mentioned, we started off with 30 files. 30 files is relatively easy to hand code. It's painful, but not too bad. You can put together a couple of Excel generators. The next 30 and then the 50 after that convinced us that we needed to put together a sync utility. Essentially what we did was we parameterized all the things that we would need to do in order to produce the code in order to handle our batch process. We plugged it into our sync utility, and out the other side came some Oozie workflows, some scoop jobs, pig scripts, and then the Hive DDL that defines all the tables that lets this all hang together. One of the things that we've been fighting a little bit with Scoop is that considering the database was made sometime during the 80s, not every table has a last update timestamp on it. So in some cases, we have to manufacture a view in order to put together a last timestamp. The other thing that we're kind of missing is that Hive doesn't have an upsert. So we still have to go through this kind of complex process of deciding which records we need to insert and which records we need to update. This is our current topology, I think as of about last week. For those of you in the front, you can't see, and for those of you in the back, you really can't see. So I'm going to go ahead and divide this up for you. The first part here is the translation layer. This is where we get the data in from HDFS, where we're storing the files that get sent to us. We're applying some of the rules to translate the cache item in INI into a row and column. And then we're also recording any INIs and items that we aren't currently handling. That way we can come back and refine the process as we go. The second area is the conversion area. Again, this system was made in the 1980s, and so they have unusual rules regarding how they handle timestamps. I think the date calculation, instead of being since 1970, is from 1840. I don't understand, but you know, that's how they roll in Madison, I guess. In addition, we're doing some foreign key lookups. We're doing some primary key mapping. And we're using some of the logic that was provided to us by the vendor. This third area is an area that I've been looking at doing some improvements on. We're currently using the Storm HBase bolts. And so we have one bolt per table that we're writing to in that outer corona. And then that inner guy is the entity bolt. And what he does is he gathers up transactions and periodically writes them out to HBase. Okay. And okay. So we said that we're writing everything to HBase, but HBase is not really known for being particularly friendly to our end-stream users. So what we have on our batch side is we've created tables and they're work files. For our real-time system, we're using the HBase storage handler so that Hive can see all the data that's being stored in HBase. And then we have the Clarity Plus view that sits on top of those. And this combines the real-time data with the batch data. If everyone remembers from when they were in 4th grade, or for some of you when you were in kindergarten, when the teacher had transparencies and they would lay them over, so first they'd have the questions, and then they'd overlay the transparency and they'd get the answers. Very similar to how this works. So for example, if yesterday I was single and today I got married and got shot in the foot and had to go to the hospital, my real-time status would say that I was married, my batch status would say that I was single, and the status that we would end up reporting on would, of course, say, thankfully, that I am married and shot in the foot for some reason. Paul?
So, oops. So the one of the interesting design decisions we made was that we wanted to create a real-time system that looked just like our existing batch system. Lots of benefits to that. We've probably got 200 analysts across our organization that already know that data model and are trained on that data model, so we wanted to leverage it and continue to just build on top of it. We just wanted to make it update faster. So we wanted to keep the same data structures in place, and I think that was a real challenge. A lot of organizations, when they come in and they decide to build something new, build something big data, they can start from scratch and build whatever data model makes the most sense technically for them. So I think that added an interesting wrinkle to our project, but it gives us the ability, our analysts, they don't need any new knowledge. They're still writing SQL. They just get data about what's happening today, and they get their answers faster. So we reuse the data model experience. We've got some huge batch jobs that people would run that now run a heck of a lot faster on our Hadoop platform than they did on the RDBMS. As an example, we had some researchers who were looking into a small patient population. They were looking at about 1,000 patients. They had some great research they did. They said, you know what, if we can scale this to a population of 19,000 patients, that would be great. And the folks on the RDBMS side did some estimations on how long it would take to run that query for them. The answer was 2 weeks. So the database is never even up for 2 weeks. So you can't possibly do that. So they took their query, ported it just about as is, and dropped it onto our Hadoop platform. And that 19,000 patient population, the query came back in half a day. So it's still a big, hefty query, but at least they could run it now in our Hadoop platform. So large analytics, things like that run faster. And also now we've got the near real-time updates. Our latency between a physician clicking some button in the EMR and that data showing up in Hadoop and being queryable by an analyst, we estimate is right around 5 minutes or so. So it's not literally real time, it's not manufacturing, control my aircraft kind of real time, but it's a whole lot better than having to wait until tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. to find out what happened this morning at 6 a.m. So that's a heck of a lot better. So just to tell you a little bit about some of our use cases, I'm actually going to start with number 2 there. So number 2 and 3, the free text search and our data archival project, those things are done. We put those into production. The free text search earlier this year, the data archival project last year, late last fall. The data archival project is a fairly simple, straightforward thing. We had our inventory management system that they roll off data, anything older than 3 years, but they still have to have it around for reporting and searching for old things and doing some things like that. They had a process in place that took that data, loaded it to SQL Server, built some Cognos cubes on top of it, and they had some reports. And that process just really, really became dog slow. So we said, hey, that'd be a great exercise for us. It would be an easy project. It's a great typical use case for Hadoop. It would help some of our more junior developers learn how to use the tools. So we threw that at them, piece of cake. It's very easy to copy files, get them loaded up, provide a schema on top, put our standard reporting tools on top of that. No big deal with that one. The free text search is actually a really interesting project, and it's been very, very exciting for our lab folks. So Mercy, we run about 16 different labs across our hospitals, and we've been moving them all off of their own individual lab systems onto a centralized one, and that's great because now all the lab stuff is in the same place and it's integrated with the electronic medical record. It's really good. That's for lots of good reasons. There's less latency sending them orders and things like that, but they're having a harder time going and doing just random searches against all their notes. So if you're not familiar with the way a medical lab works, they'll get, so for instance with physiology kind of studies, they'll get a lab specimen in, it'll come in a vial or something like that. They will receive it, and the lab tech will type in a whole bunch of notes about what they received and what it looks like and whose name is on it. And then they'll take that and they'll open it up and they'll slice it up and they'll put it on slides and they'll write down what they did. And then they'll put it underneath the microscope and they'll write down notes about what they see underneath the microscope. And eventually at the very end of that, they'll provide some sort of discrete information that says, hey, this is what we saw. And there'll be some discrete fields at the end of it, and that's the most important thing for diagnostics. But all that other information about what they saw along the way, that's really important information. They have this expectation that when some VP walks in and says, hey, can you find all the patients who we ever saw that had this sort of symptom or this sort of thing show up on a slide? The expectation has been, and because they've been able to do it in the past, that they can just find that out in real time. They can just go type at the computer and come back with an answer in a matter of minutes. With the new consolidated lab system, there's just too much, right? It's too much data now, all consolidated in one system. Scaling that might work, but also doing free text search in the RDBMS is a bit of a challenge. So what we did for them was we took all of their data, brought it into Hadoop, made it searchable, we wired up our reporting tools on top of it, and now they can go into their standard reporting tools, the same ones they use for their labor and productivity reports and financial reports, and then go type in something about the histology of the cells, and they've got a query that comes back, a report that comes back in about 3 seconds. So 15-minute query or stuff they can't even do down to 3 seconds, that's made the lab folks pretty happy. So we really like that one. And it will also be able to take advantage of the real-time data too. So they can run those same queries on labs that they're seeing right now, reports that they're seeing right now in the labs. The fourth one down there, our EMR Audit Trail, archiving and reporting. So how many folks are in healthcare? I assume that most of you are in healthcare because why else would you be in this session? But so we all know HIPAA. And one of the things that HIPAA requires us to do is to keep an audit trail of every time anybody, any coworker, looks at any patient's record. And you as a patient, if you want to go ask the hospital for that information, they're obliged to provide it to you. Well, in our traditional RDBMS, that audit trail was literally 50% of the database. So today we've scaled that down to be a 26 terabyte database. That means that this data set by itself is about 26 terabytes. It's 37 billion rows of data for the last, since about 2008. So the last 7 years of data is 26 terabytes and 37 billion rows of activity. So for us, that's pretty big. So we had that on a separate specialized other database platform. We've decided to move that in and bring it into HBase using Phoenix. And so it's our first Phoenix project. And so far, so good. It's still in development. The guys are working on it right now. And it looks like it's going to be a successful project. So we're very excited about that. So make it SQL queryable, store the data really efficiently, add compression on top of that. And we're still not taking up a huge amount of space. And we'll have some pretty fast queries out of it too. Then our big project is this medical documentation improvement effort. And these are the folks who really got us kicked off with our first real production project. And we're just at the tail end of this. These are the guys who really, really demanded the real-time data. So if you're kind of thinking about it this way, if you're not familiar with the way some of the back office stuff happens in healthcare, this is my version of explaining it. You go to see the doctor writes down a whole bunch of notes about what the encounter was like. Sometimes they use smart forms to fill in that data, but often it's a lot of free text. When you're discharged, what happens is that there are folks who do clinical coding. So they go through and they look at that documentation and they update the chart with codes. And if you watch the news, we were supposed to do ICD-10 last October. Who knows what's going to happen this October? Congress doesn't want to force people to do it. I don't know what's going to end up happening, but those are the kind of codes we're talking about. And then that goes into the billing process. We end up with billing codes and claims that get sent out, and those go to insurance companies who, after some negotiation, we do adjustments and things like that, eventually get paid. We as providers do get paid eventually. And then the tricky part is that up to 3, 4, 5 years later, the government can come along and do an audit and say, you know what, back a few years ago, we've been looking at the volumes of this type of procedure, and we think that we probably overpaid you, Mercy. We would like to have 20% of what we paid you back. We're going to hold that while we also review all of your clinical documentation. We would like to review the documentation and make sure that you have evidence that this particular procedure was medically necessary, or that kind of thing, or that you coded it correctly so that we paid you correctly. So all of this whole stuff around revenue cycle is driven by, upfront, the documentation. Is the documentation good enough? So our medical documentation improvement efforts are all about looking at the documentation, getting people able to see the documentation earlier and catching particular kinds of encounters that are more prone to seeing either gaps in documentation or missing documentation, and being able to push that work up front so that the coding folks can actually query physicians about the chart, about the documentation, can send them queries while the patient is still in the facility, and not wait until after the patient's already been discharged and after that case is starting to trail out of the physician's head. Because imagine, you see a lot of patients every day trying to think back to that particular patient who you saw 4 days ago and what the situation was, and then go add more documentation. Well, if you can add that documentation the same day that you're seeing the patient, that's a whole lot better. So that's the goal with medical documentation improvement, is to get those medical documentation reviews up front, get the doctors to provide better documentation, turn that into better revenue stream stuff going on down the road, more efficient, making sure that we're documenting accurately, getting paid accurately, all kinds of good stuff like that. So that's really what's driven us from a real-time perspective. Some other things that are on the horizon for us, these are things that we haven't really started on yet. Some of them we've done a little bit of prototyping with, but we don't have any solid projects underway. We've got text analytics, something that we think is really big. So adding on to the medical documentation, do some actual text analytics on the documentation and use that to help the coding, the reviewers, the documentation reviewers, get better insights faster into the quality of the documentation, as well as all kinds of other places that we see text across the medical record. Device data is a big exciting one, of course. We hear about IoT, and in the medical industry that's huge. Mercy runs a very large electronic ICU facility where we monitor 400 ICU beds out of one central monitoring location. We're adding on to that some other services that we provide that will increase the number of devices that we're getting clinical information from, medical information from. So we're looking at leveraging Hadoop in that device data processing, or capturing that and using it for later analysis. And then the other big one is real-time alerting. So not necessarily always providing clinical recommendations medical recommendations to physicians or nurses, but being able to do things like there are lots of rules around the operations of healthcare that make it pretty confusing. So if we can help by putting in place some fairly unobtrusive alerts to say, hey, things like one of the prime examples is the documentation of an infusion pump stop time. So this is one that we've worked on a lot of process improvement. We've done Lean Six Sigma improvements on for a long time. The idea is, when you've got an IV drip, you've got some kind of medication coming through an IV, the nurse will hang that and they'll program the machine, and it will stop when it's supposed to stop. So there's nothing at risk for you there medically, but if that nurse forgets to document the time that the machine stopped and put that documentation in the electronic medical record, then we can't get paid for that IV having been done. So if there are gaps in the documentation like this, then if we can solve those gaps, that has a huge impact on our operations and on our revenue too. And then the last one is, for several years now, Mercy's we've built an integrated patient database. We have claim data. We were part of a physician group practice program with CMS for years out of our hospital in Springfield, and now we're running an ACO out of Springfield, Missouri. And we've always had a lot of integrated patient data, but now folks are starting to ask for even more and more and more, and we're starting to really blow beyond the scale of our RDBMS, and having this new platform in place becomes a really obvious way to do that data integration and build up a more comprehensive view of who a patient is and be able to do more of that analysis a lot faster. So with that, I think we're open for questions. There's a mic there too. I don't know if we need to use the mic or not, but.
How do you actually get your data? What's the source?
The source is Epic. The source, so we use Epic as our EMR, and the source is the underlying cache database.
So to be more specific and technical, do you guys have APIs that your clients can use and upload data?
At this point, we can talk about the detailed specifics of that offline.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so my question is basically, do you guys have considered, Apple just came out with HealthKit?
Yeah.
So you can get live data from Apple Watch?
Integrating personal device data. That's something that we're looking at. I think that the the folks who have run our electronic ICU for years and are the ones really bringing on all the new device data, they're building something called our virtual care center, and they're going to start bringing in, I don't know if they're talking about hooking up with HealthKit yet, but they're certainly looking at other home monitoring devices that are a little bit more, I guess a little bit more passive, things like scales and stuff like that. So I just don't know. I don't know what the exact plan is there.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, for the searching on like PathLab and other reports, were you using Solar for that, or
Yep.
okay?
Yeah, and just to talk about that a little bit, one of the things we really liked about the way we were able to do that, we already had all the notes and stuff that we were syncing over from the DBMS and getting through our real-time feed. So to get it into Solar was really just it was dirt simple. I mean, we built Hive on Solar and just wrote a query that compiled all the data the way we needed it and dumped it into Solar. So I really, really liked that. That was great.
Thanks.
Do you have any thoughts on how you're going to start building this integrated patient database in your Hadoop clusters?
Technically, or where we start from a data perspective?
I guess technically, what products might you use?
I think for the most part, we're going to leverage the tools we already have in place. So there'll be things like Scoop and Hive, and if there's any of that comes in a way that makes sense for real time, we'd use Storm for that. Yeah.
You mentioned about making some of the notes searchable. Did you have to do it through any of the OCR for scanned documents, or they're all text that came into the system?
So all of the current lab information, we decided to keep our scope for the implementation to our new lab system. So all of that is digital text. We did actually go and look. So one part of that effort of implementing the new lab system is to retire all the old lab systems. And some of those old lab systems had PDF files. So we actually took a sample of those and we ran Oracle's Tesseract, or Google's Tesseract against it, an OCR product. And it turned out okay. There were a lot of issues about flipping the images and stuff like that. And so we sort of offered that up and said, hey, we could do this. How important is it to you, to our folks who run the labs? They were like, it'd be nice, but we'll get there after we're done implementing the new lab system. So maybe that'll come along next.
So my question is from a security and compliance perspective, are you putting anything around this infrastructure so that you're more compliant from a security perspective?
So from more of an infrastructure kind of perspective, we've got stuff walled off in firewalls, and we've got Kerberos enabled on the cluster, so authentication is pretty tight. From an audit perspective, we're still looking at exactly what we want to do from an audit perspective to track who exactly is accessing what pieces of data when. Most of our access, except for our developers and our research team, most of the access is through some sort of front end. So it might be business objects or another reporting tool. And there we rely on that audit trail. All right. Thank you very much. We appreciate your time.